The Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and your local cable provider presents Cable Reports. Join us now as Cable Reports brings you up to date on current issues facing the Commonwealth through discussions with your local legislators and other policymakers from across Virginia.
From the General Assembly and the City of Richmond, I'm Woody Evans for Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association, connecting Virginians to their government. We're very pleased to have Senator Adam Ebbin with us today from Northern Virginia, representing Fairfax, Alexandria, and Arlington. Good to see you, sir.
It's good to be back. Thanks, Woody.
Tell us about Northern Virginia, especially your district and the economy, how things are going up there.
Sure. Well, I represent Alexandria, Arlington, and Fairfax, as you said. On the Potomac River, the district goes from Reagan National Airport to Crystal City to Old Town to the Mount Vernon Estate to Fort Belvoir.
Wow.
And substantially west of there. The viewers in Arlington who live south of Columbia Pike, I represent them. Alexandrians east of Quaker Lane and a little bit over. And then parts of Mount Vernon and Lee District that goes along in Franconia Road a bit.
So you've got about 200,000 constituents, I believe.
That's right, and we've got a lot of different interests. You asked about Northern Virginia's economy. We traditionally have the lowest unemployment in the state, but one thing that we're very mindful of is cuts from federal sequestration, particularly to government contracting and military contracting, which we are greatly affected by.
So that obviously affects jobs, and I know that's a big interest of yours. Tell us some of the things you're doing to ensure that jobs stay in your district and that new jobs are created.
Well, we need to diversify our economy in Northern Virginia, and I'm supporting the governor's initiatives, and I'm proud of the fact that he's brought $5.5 billion in new investment to Virginia, economic investment and new jobs. He has brought more jobs and investment in Virginia than any governor to date has done. In fact, twice as many as any governor in their first year of their term. But I'm working on workforce development. I'm very concerned with giving flexibility to innovate and to find jobs for people to our local workforce investment boards. In Northern Virginia, the boards seem to be doing a very good job. But around the state, I want to be able to take advantage of new federal authority, which allows them to pay for performance in placing people in jobs.
Okay.
They train people and do other things, matching them with jobs. But if they train people in Northern Virginia at a cost of up to $3,700, but you don't find a job, that's a lot of money to spend if you don't place the person. So I want to allow them to pay a company for performance when they place them.
Great. Now, to what extent do the community colleges play a role in workforce development?
The community colleges are probably our number one source of training for workforce development. And in Northern Virginia, we are bursting at the seams at NOVA, which actually the Alexandria campus is in my district. And I'm sorry to say that the president of Northern Virginia Community College is going to be retiring. It's well-deserved, but I think he's done an outstanding job.
And of course, it serves a number of roles in terms of job creation. It allows students who may not be able to afford our institutions of higher learning to make that first step, and it has allowed a number of adults who lost jobs to get retraining.
That's absolutely right, and it's been my pleasure to speak to classes with adults, or primarily with adults in them. And you know, I was proud a few years ago when I was in the House to vote for and help shape legislation that provides for matriculation agreements so that if kids maintain a particular GPA in the community colleges, that they can be guaranteed admission into particular four-year institutions.
And of course, we're all proud of the four-year institutions in the Commonwealth, not the least of which is, you know, George Mason, for example.
Sure.
UVA, Virginia Tech, you name it.
They are all doing a great job, and one of the unfortunate circumstances of our current budget situation is that there have been cuts to colleges. And there's a mindset down here, and in general, which has a degree of truth, in that if you cut universities' funding, that they can always increase tuition. but increasing tuition is not what I want to see.
Right, exactly. Talk to us about ethics reform, because that's been in the news for a couple of years now. Former governor was convicted as a result of ethical violations. And I know it's being re-examined this year. There was some tweaks made last year. What's your opinion on what needs to be done?
Well, there's a lot that needs to be done. Last year I had a much broader bill than what was adopted, and I offered 14 amendments on the floor of the Senate to broaden our ethics reform. And one unfortunate effect of the McDonald trial and the conviction is that the public trust, it's so easy to lose, but it's very hard to regain the public trust. And we have had in the past, and still, unfortunately, members take trips on corporate jets to golf tournaments, members take safaris. This is not something that that my Northern Virginia colleagues typically do. In fact, I'm not aware of any of them doing that. But it's something that's just not tolerable. So my amendment last year and my legislation this year would forbid travel, with the exception of bona fide travel that provides good information, helps us do our jobs better, foreign exchanges that promote commerce with the Commonwealth, that sort of thing. But I want to set up an independent ethics commission. I don't want to have the General Assembly policing itself. And that's something we need to move towards.
So that commission would then give guidance and police the activities of members of the General Assembly, I assume.
That's right. We set up last year a toothless ethics advisory commission, but the only General Assembly members who are appointed are one member from each chamber, and they typically are members of the majority party. I don't want to lead any credence to any thought that one party could be represented and not treating people fairly, and the commission doesn't have any teeth. We found of those members, and it's been fairly rare, but when people get in trouble for unethical behavior, it's typically been the federal government that takes the lead.
And of course, defining terms within the context of either a commission or the law itself will be important. As we know, who is a close personal friend or a relative, as an exception, for example, in terms of giving some kind of benefit in return for something else. Also the question of whether the gift is tangible or intangible. Those are some of the things that will be further debated, I take it.
Right. I'm pretty detail-oriented myself, and I think it's important that we get it right. Last year I offered an amendment that members would have to report the gifts to their immediate families, including not just children who reside in the household, but children who might not reside in the household, whether they're in college or boarding school. And the Senate rejected it for some reason on a voice vote, just as they rejected my travel amendment. Some of the same people who were against my stricter reforms last year are now calling for them this year. So we'll move in the right direction. I just hope we get it right in our 45-day session.
Great. Gun violence, I know, is another issue that you've been involved in and continue to be involved in. What can we expect this session?
Well, it's a tough fight, but I think it's important that my constituents and others know I don't want to take away someone's right to have a firearm, their Second Amendment right, if they're not a felon. But I think there are common sense things we can do to get it right. I don't want to see kids 4 years and under legally allowed to handle the firearm, whether in the presence of their parents or not. Under Virginia law, that's not an outright crime. Further, I would like to see a universal background check. I attended a gun show out in Chantilly and was surprised how easy it was for a colleague of mine to buy a weapon and without a background check. And I asked if I could buy a high-capacity weapon, an automatic gun, and was told no problem, that I didn't look like a bank robber, according to the seller. And I even bought a high-capacity magazine, and it was like buying a pack of gum. It was way too easy.
So these are private sales because these people are not federally registered as a number of the vendors at a gun show are, but these are just private individuals who you're able to purchase firearms from.
That's where you get the loophole, but some of these so-called private individuals set up rather large booths at gun shows. While most people at a gun show are doing a background check, which takes less than 5 minutes, I went to the gun show and I said, where can I get a gun that's not through a background check? I went to a booth, and when I said that I wanted to buy a weapon, I asked the dealer, who ostensibly specialized in antiques, if he could get me a Glock, and he told me that wouldn't be a problem.
So what are the arguments that the other side uses? Because you would think that no one wants a felon in possession, someone who's subject to a domestic order of protection, anyone who's been involved in domestic violence, terrorism, those kinds of things.
Well, it actually, there's not a specific provision in Virginia law that prohibits someone with a protective order against them from having a weapon. It was one of the first bills I brought to Richmond 11 years ago, and I was shocked at how easily it was disposed of in a House committee. It's hard to summarize their arguments, but I would say that I've had people in my office argue that a bill to prohibit a kid under 5 from touching a firearm, that should pass. They were against that. So when you get that kind of mindset, it's challenging. I do understand the argument of their inconvenience of having to go through a background check if they want to sell a gun to a so-called collector or another party if they're not a authorized dealer. But I think going through the background check is a small price to pay for safety.
Budget is always in the news. It's a huge issue. There's a constitutional requirement in the Commonwealth that it be balanced. You'll be working on those issues as well. Tell us what kinds of things are in play.
Well, actually, the governor has done a great job of reaching out in a bipartisan way to members of the money committees for some agreement. He's submitted a balanced budget, and what I was most excited about is that it doesn't cut K through 12 education. And that is my focus for this session, is not to cut school children's spending. Unfortunately, we're still not at the point where we were 7 years ago on a per pupil spending. But that's my focus.
Well, what about pre-K? Because that's also been the subject of much discussion over the last few years.
Well, I've introduced budget amendments to make it pre-K funding more accessible for low-income children to be ready to learn with their peers. I don't see increases in this year's session, and that's unfortunate, but my colleagues will not support tax increases of any kind that would cover that.
And I take it that also would apply to one of the other governor's initiatives dealing with expanding the programs for breakfast and lunch, K through 12.
I think it's important that kids are ready to learn when they go to school, and that one kid isn't well fed and the other kid in poverty doesn't have a meal. I'm hoping they'll be able to make use of some federal grants, but I don't think that there'll be new money from the Commonwealth allocated this year.
What are you hearing in terms of the necessity to further tweak the standards of learning, for example, from your local school districts?
I'm not hearing quite as much from the local districts. Parents are concerned. And we made a great start last year with the leadership of Delegate Rob Krupika of Alexandria, Delegate Tag Greason of Loudoun. And what we want to do is have fewer tests, which we started down that path last year. And now we're looking at allowing children to retake the test if they don't pass. I mean, once they acquire the knowledge, that's what we're concerned with, not if it takes more than one time for them to pass the test.
What about some criteria that apparently is somewhat controversial to actually grade the schools themselves through A through F?
Sure, I voted against that. We want to help schools, and we know which schools need help, but when you grade a school with one grade, it's a big generalization. When you have a student in school, you don't give them just one grade. You grade them in science, mathematics, language arts, and their other subjects. And the same thing for the school. We can assess the schools and figure out how to help them best, but it's pretty simplistic to give them one grade.
And should the state have the authority to take over failing schools? There was a statute that was passed that has now been declared unconstitutional.
No, that's been ruled unconstitutional,
Right.
and our Constitution allows for local control of schools. State help is great. The localities going to the state for more help is great, not just monetary help, but taking over is another matter.
Right. Let's talk about gender equality, especially as relates to gays who are employed by the state. There's some discrimination issues there. I know you're involved in that. You've had legislation going on with reference to that. Where does that stand?
Sure. I've worked directly with the last 4 governors to see that 3 of them adopt executive orders protecting state employees from discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. So right now they're protected thanks to Governor McAuliffe's executive order. But we just go back and forth, and it shouldn't be at the whim of a governor. In fact, even on the basis of race, religion, national origin, there are no statutory requirements that those categories be protected. They're all from an executive order that it comes and goes as governors come and go. It's time just to put it in the code and put that behind us.
And what about marriage equality? We've had a number of U.S. Supreme Court decisions. Apparently there's going to be another one yet this term, but I know you have some legislation dealing with that too.
Sure. It's clear that in Virginia that we have gay couples being married, and what we need to do is recognize the reality of that in the Code and Constitution of Virginia. We have a marriage amendment that's a stain on the Virginia Declaration of Rights in our Constitution. We need to repeal that, but in the short term, I have legislation that would see that in the code, where there's references to husband and wife, that could also be recognized as spouse. And by recognizing it as spouse for tax purposes, legal purposes, inheritance purposes, we're just bringing clarity to the code. And really, when you read the Code of Virginia, it needs to reflect what the law really is.
Now, I think if my memory serves me correctly, you were instrumental in some legislation that allowed a couple, when one dies, to receive proceeds of an insurance policy.
That's right.
Right.
I worked in a bipartisan way to see that Virginians were allowed to make life insurance beneficiaries of someone other than their lawfully wedded spouse. Now that there are lawfully wedded spouses, it's
Right.
not quite as important. But still, even if you want to leave an estate or a life insurance policy to an adult child or whomever you want to, your cousin, your mother, you should be able to. And I'm proud of that legislation.
Great. Marijuana, decriminalization. It's interesting, a number of years ago, I think it was Delegate Harvey Morgan, who at least wanted to take the first step and allow marijuana as a medicinal remedy.
Sure.
I don't think that ever made it out of committee either. But be that as it may, I know that you have some legislation dealing with decriminalization. Why don't you explain what that means?
Sure. Well, Delegate Morgan's legislation, among his legislation years ago, was to decriminalize marijuana. He's a pharmacist, and he knew that marijuana is not the same kind of harmful substance as a lot of drugs, and that compared to alcohol, we're not as harmful, it can be argued, to people. What my bill does is it lessens the penalty. I don't think there should be the prospect of spending jail time for small amounts, but I don't even think people should jump through hoops, have to go and be tested repeatedly, have to lose their driver's license on a temporary or permanent basis for possessing marijuana.
So would it be treated like a traffic ticket then?
That's right. There'd be a fine rather than a criminal penalty. And there'd be no possibility for small amounts of getting it on your record. We don't need a record for people who've possessed small amounts of marijuana.
Now, what about some of the concerns that some people raise, basically saying that there's going to have to be an additional regime put in place that would allow for persons who are under the influence of marijuana to be prosecuted if they are involved in a driving incident, for example?
Well, that would remain.
Okay.
No one wants to see children using marijuana. No one wants to see people impaired on our roads. But possessing a small amount for use in your home or having it on your person should not be a criminal offense, in my opinion.
I guess the argument is that there's not an easy test to determine whether one is under the influence of marijuana versus alcohol, for example.
Right. Well, there are field tests to see if people are are impaired, and those same field tests could be employed, in my opinion.
Now, you were a co-founder of the Progressive Caucus, I believe. Tell us what the Progressive Caucus is doing in the General Assembly these days.
Well, actually, the Progressive Caucus is not active these days because our Democratic caucuses have really stepped up and are addressing the issues that we care about. So we're trying to work together within our Democratic caucuses with the governor for a unified message, not just about business, but about building a fair Virginia and a Virginia that's welcoming to all kinds of people, because that's good for business. And the other issues we care about have been prioritized within our own caucuses.
You know, I don't think people realize the subject I'm going to quiz you about is such a problem because it's not in the news that much, but it is. Human trafficking. Talk to us about that issue and how prevalent it is.
Well, we know that in the 30th District, there have been cases in Franconia and Mount Vernon of children being trafficked who are still in high school. We know in Arlington along Columbia Pike years ago that there was a case of girls being actually sold door to door, or sold as their prostitution.
Right.
Prostitution being marketed door to door in Arlington. It's awful, but it's not just in the 30th District. It's a national problem, and I've proposed again to create a commission on the prevention of human trafficking in Virginia to look at it in a comprehensive way and make recommendations. I chaired a similar commission years ago, and it's something that keeps coming up.
So the first step would be to increase awareness, I take it, to make sure that the public understands the seriousness of this and then take it further.
Right. We need to make sure law enforcement is trained. We need to make sure that there are adequate criminal penalties, as I've increased some, but it needs to be looked at in a comprehensive way, not just as a patchwork.
Hotel taxes. I know there's some legislation you're pursuing with reference to that. Talk to us about that, and what does it seek to remedy?
Sure, and it's really online travel companies.
Okay.
If you go to Expedia or these other companies like Travelocity or Hotels.com, you're paying them perhaps $100 for a hotel room. They might be paying the hotel $80, but they're not charging you the tax. They're charging you the tax and fee on $100, but they're not remitting that to the hotel. All of Virginia's hotel organizations are supporting this. We don't need the online people to pocket what's the fair share of the tax that should be going to the transient occupancy tax to market our tourism industry.
Electoral reform, especially in terms of voter identification. We now know you have to, in order to vote in the state, have a photo identification. That's caused a lot of problems for a lot of different groups of people throughout the Commonwealth. You have legislation to correct some of those inequalities, I believe.
Sure. I mean, I've been active in trying to see that it's easier to vote, not harder. But I find it particularly egregious that if you're an employee of, say, Georgetown University and have a photo ID, you can use that for voting. But if you're a student at an out-of-state educational institution like Georgetown, you couldn't use your student photo ID. And my bill would allow both out-of-state student IDs and student IDs from in-state private high schools, just like we do from public high schools for 18-year-olds.
Now, what about absentee voting? I don't know if you're involved with any legislation in that regard, but it's fairly restrictive in the Commonwealth.
Yes.
Is there a move to remove some of those restrictions, especially for those age 65 and older?
Well, I've continued to co-sponsor legislation to allow people who are 65 and older to absentee vote without further excuse. I've also co-sponsored legislation in the past and introduced it to allow all to vote absentee if they should choose without an excuse. I've made it easier to absentee vote and to count those votes by working on the application for that and to see whose are counted. This year I'm working with Senator Janet Howell to see that those who state that their reason is a religious obligation not have to state what their religious obligation is. I think it's too far for government to be questioning you about your religious activities.
Custodial arrangements between spouses, other relatives, and agreements relating thereto. There's some legislation you're working on in reference to that, I believe.
Sure. A constituent from Alexandria brought to my attention that when we consider the best interests of the child, although we specifically consider if the parent has been an abuser or even a murderer, and the judge taking that into account, that we don't specifically say that if they've been an abuser outside the family or conducted such a serious and heinous crime as murder, that that's not enumerated as something they should consider. So that's a common sense fix.
Now, we talked earlier about the fact that sequestration has had some significant economic negative impacts. We do have a lot of veterans. I believe there's a new veterans facility that's going to be sited in northern Virginia. You probably have a lot of veterans in your constituency. Are we doing enough, especially for our returning veterans, in terms of education, helping them become entrepreneurs and things of that nature?
Well, we always can do more, and one of the reasons that I introduced the Workforce Investment Opportunity Act supplement to allow for performance-based incentives is to help hard-to-place populations, and that includes veterans. And now that Senator Toddy Puller of Mount Vernon has announced her retirement, and she's been a champion for veterans, we need to take up that cause even further, and I'm looking forward to doing my best to follow in her footsteps.
Clean energy, I know that's something you've promoted throughout your career. Talk to us what the state needs to do to promote that even more.
Well, we're talking this year about expanding net metering, meaning that if you have a green facility within your own home, that you could sell electricity back to the utility, and we're talking about expanding how much you could sell back to the utility. Virginia is not a leader on green energy. I've tried to work towards solar, but Delegate Alfonso Lopez of Arlington has really been a leader on this now, and I'm working with him to see that we can do a better job.
Great. Well, it's always a pleasure to have you here. Good luck in the next 43 or so days.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you for watching Cable Reports. We're pleased to have Senator Adam Ebbin from Northern Virginia here. Cable Reports is brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association. Until next time, I'm Woody Evans. Mm-hmm.